This brings us into the era of Red Power, which is a movement in the starting in the late 1960s toward taking more direct action to achieve the things that the NCAI and the National Indian Youth Council had been calling for. That is the restoration of sovereignty. Hence the motto there: if you want to be sovereign, you have to act sovereign. That is, take direct action. And this was modeled on Black Power, the Black Power movement, which really got started in 1966, 67. And according to Stokely Carmichael, African American activist, Black Power was defined as Black self-determination and Black self-identity. That is, taking control of your own destiny rather than waiting for for the white majority to do it, and also to embrace your Black self-identity rather than have a sense of self-loathing and inferiority imposed on you by the white majority. So you can see how these philosophies lined up. Of course, you do have to understand that the Red Power movement, their goals, although similar, were slightly different, particularly if you compare them to the civil rights movement that was the sort of the era right before Black Power, right, with Dr. King and so forth, in which the goal of Black activists had been to be accepted by the majority, to be granted their full rights as citizens. And then with Black Power, that goal was there, but there was also a strong sense of self-identity and purpose and self-direction. The Red Power movement was not geared toward full rights as American citizens by Native people. It was the opposite. That's what termination was. It was actually the effort to maintain their uniqueness as tribal nations, to maintain their sovereignty and not to be absorbed into the majority. You can't talk about Red Power without talking about AIM, the American Indian Movement. And this is their flag right here. This is an organization that was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis. Remember how I told you earlier that Minneapolis became sort of urban Indian central? There were quite a few Native Americans living in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Twin Cities, by 1968. In fact, they made up 10% of the population, mostly concentrated in the neighborhood of Franklin. Well, 10% of the population, yet they made up 70% of the jail population in 1968 in those two cities. And this organization really kind of sprang from that concern over that situation, the feeling that Native Americans were being targeted, being singled out, and being harassed by the police. Incidentally, by 1975, this was built, the American Indian Center, right there in that neighborhood. One of the first such centers, community centers in the country, specifically for Native Americans. Anyway, getting back to AIM. Well, there were several young men, young Ojibwe men, all of whom were ex-cons, all of whom felt they personally had been targeted and harassed, who came together to decide to try to do something about the situation there in that neighborhood, in that city. And the individuals involved were all from either the Leech Lake Ojibwe Reservation originally, or the White Earth Reservation. In 1963, Eddie Benton Benai and Clyde Belcourt, who were both Ojibwe, were in prison together. This photograph, by the way, is from 30 years afterward. I couldn't find any young photographs of Benai. Anyway, while they were in prison together and became friends, they were inspired by the things that were going on in the civil rights movement for African Americans, also things that we previously discussed that were going on concerning Native Americans in the early 1960s. And so when they got out of prison, they started trying to make efforts to organize and do something similar. Then, a few years later, 1968, they had made the acquaintance of Dennis Banks and several other people, and they came together. A meeting initially of 6 young Ojibwe men, all of whom were ex-cons, to talk about these issues and to figure out how to take direct action. By this time, they had been inspired not by the peace marches so much, although they initially used some of those tactics, but rather by the Black Panthers out in Oakland, California, who had become nationally known, established and nationally known the previous year. So the full name of the Black Panthers, if you don't know, is the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And their goal out there in Oakland was to, quote, police the police, end quote, because there were so many incidents of police brutality. That's how the Black Panthers started. They started patrolling the streets to be on hand when a black person was arrested. Well, this new organization, the American Indian Movement, that was going to be their goal as well. They were going to, quote, straighten this country out, starting with Minneapolis. And so among the first things they did was raise money for radios so that there could be a communications network so that they would know when an American Indian was being arrested by the police and quickly make sure that they were on hand to be witnesses and to intercede if necessary to prevent the death of the individual. So they got together, and this is a photograph here of the first board of directors of the American Indian Movement, and it included some of the more prominent leaders there, particularly in the early years. There's Clyde Belcourt, Peggy Belcourt next to him, and there's Dennis Banks. There's Charles Deegan and George Mitchell. Eddie Benton Benai is not in the picture, but Rita Rogers is. Rita Rogers was a prison social worker. She was also White Earth Ojibwe. In addition to that, she was the first Native American to own and operate a restaurant in the Franklin neighborhood of Minnesota. Well, they got together. They chose officers with Clyde Belcourt as the first chair of the organization, with Deegan as the vice chair, and Dennis Banks as the field director. The organization grew rapidly, not just in Minneapolis, but chapters started springing up around the country. One of the first was in Denver, founded by Clyde Belcourt's older brother Vernon, who would also become a prominent leader in the overall organization. Some of the people who joined within the first few months of AIM's founding would go on to become very prominent figures and leaders within the organization. Certainly this guy, Russell Means, who was an Oglala Lakota. He had been born on the Pine Ridge Reservation. But in 1942, when he was 3 years old, his father moved the family to San Francisco because there was all that defense work during World War II. He went to work in the shipyards. So Means actually grew up in the San Francisco area and became an activist as an adult and was involved with several different aspects of Native American rights stuff when AIM came along and he joined them. Another early recruit that would rise to prominence was Carter Camp, who was a Ponca from Oklahoma. He had, he'd served in the military, and when he was discharged, he lived in Los Angeles for a while working as an electrician. But when AIM came about, he joined pretty soon after the founding, and he was the person who established the first AIM chapters in both Kansas and Oklahoma. Like Dennis Banks and many other AIM members, Carter Camp had been taken from his family and raised in a boarding school, and he was a graduate of the Haskell Institute in Kansas that we talked about earlier. Dennis Banks ran away from 2 or 3 different boarding schools and spoke often about the trauma on his whole generation and previous generations as a result of this policy. In 1969, members of AIM, along with several other Native American activist organizations, got involved in a prolonged incident on Alcatraz Island, which is a little island there in the bay off of San Francisco, which was the site of a very famous prison right up there with Sing Sing for prisons that were, famous in popular culture in the 20th century. That was it was placed on this island full of it made it hard to escape, right? Virtually impossible, and no one ever really did, except Clint Eastwood, of course. But aside from that, anyway, the prison had been closed down in the mid 1960s because they had already built a new prison, and so they weren't going to use this one anymore. So all the personnel had left, and essentially the government was trying to decide what to do with it. When in November 1969, a boat filled with young Native American activists belonging to a group called Indians of All Tribes made their way to this island and planted a flag and said, "Hey, look, we discovered an island." And in fact, there was a very obscure treaty which had stated back in the 1860s, I believe, that any government fort that was abandoned by the federal government could be claimed by Indians. And lo and behold, here they were claiming it. There were initially 89 occupiers, and they added their distinctive touch to the island, including not only the planting of the flag and the declaration that it was Indian land that they had gained by right of discovery. They painted a sign saying "Indians welcome," and immediately the media converged. There had actually been an earlier occupation attempt with just a couple of dozen Native Americans 2 years earlier in 1967, and that one had involved Russell Means and his father, but it didn't attract attention and it didn't get off the ground. This one, in November 1969, was much larger, and it grew to be even larger still. And this one was the brainchild of Adam Nordwall, alias Adam Fortunate Eagle, a 40-year-old activist, Ojibwe, who lived in lived in San Francisco. And he had coordinated with a student leader named Richard Oakes, who was Mohawk. And Oakes had gotten the students together, and then they had gotten a boat and made their way to the island. These two guys would get a lot of the press. Adam Fortunate Eagle from shore, because he didn't stay on the island, although he visited occasionally, riding or standing at the prow of the boat like George Washington very dramatically each time. Oakes was actually among those living there, and he was the one that was frequently getting interviewed. However, many people who lived on the island during the occupation said that the real leader and the real organizer on the ground that kept things going was this woman, Lenata Warjack, at the time known as Lenata Means, no relation to Russell Means. She was from the Shoshone-Bannock Reservation, and she was a student at Berkeley at that time. Realizing that with the sad state of 1969 America, she would not get the press coverage or the attention that Oakes or Fortunate Eagle would. Lenata Means Warjack instead did most of the writing. She wrote up press releases, she wrote up various statements. Another leader during the occupation was a 48-year-old Sauk and Fox woman named Grace Thorpe, seen here on the radio with John Trudell. Note the copy of Custer Died for Your Sins in front of her. Grace Thorpe was from Oklahoma and was, in fact, the daughter of the famous Native American athlete Jim Thorpe. And not only that, she was a World War II veteran. She had been in the Women's Army Corps and had, in fact, been awarded a Bronze Star for courage under fire when under attack by the Japanese. Well, she was able to use her connections to get a generator for the island, to get a water barge and an ambulance service, and also to contact celebrities like Jane Fonda and Marlon Brando, who were supporters of the movement and were willing to speak up. They may have started with 89 occupiers, but hundreds more joined on Thanksgiving of that year. And speaking of John Trudell,
America is still conducting a genocidal war against the Indian people.
Program and sell democracy across the world the way Hitler sold Nazism,
We have watched this American lie called American freedom and American democracy feed upon our people and attack the earth upon which we live.
1 week into the occupation, one of the people that came to the island to join in was John Trudell, a Santee Dakota, and a recently returned Vietnam veteran who was attending San Bernardino Community College studying communications and radio. And he decided to use his skills to contribute by setting up an impromptu radio station and, with the help of students at Berkeley, through whom it was transmitted, and transmitting the message of ALCATRAZ and its occupiers to the rest of the country. Trudell would join AIM as a result of meeting Dennis Banks and Russell Means here at the ALCATRAZ occupation, and would go on to become a prominent AIM leader. Altogether, the occupation lasted almost 2 years, but for a good part of the latter part of that, there were only a handful of people left. But in the early days, the early months, there were large numbers of people present. There was a lot of press coverage. Eventually, when the people started to filter away little by little, Sherman Oaks and his wife left after their child died in an accident on the island. Eventually, when there were only a few people left, the electricity was cut off, and they were eventually forced to leave. Nonetheless, this was a huge event and a huge turning point because people were seeing this on the news every night, and they were being made aware that Native American Indians were not vanished Americans. They still existed, and they still had some major issues and major problems, and they started to gain some sympathy. Well, the members of the movement, particularly AIM, started taking other direct actions after this to get more public attention. But first, the American Indian movement leadership decided they needed to make a slight course adjustment. They decided that it wasn't enough to be an activist organization. It wasn't enough to use methods and tactics of other groups. In order to truly have the spirit of American Indian culture, they decided they needed to take a spiritual direction. They needed spiritual guidance and a connection to the land, which made them unique and different from other civil rights activists. So in 1970, Dennis Banks and other leaders from the AIM went down to the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota to meet with someone they had been hearing about, a charismatic young medicine man who was also an activist, 28 years old, named Leonard Crow Dog. Now, you may remember hearing the name Crow Dog more than once back in the 19th century, right? The Lakota warrior who was involved in that famous Supreme Court case and who later was also involved in the ghost dance movement. This was his great-grandson. So they met with Leonard Crow Dog, and he became the spiritual advisor to the American Indian movement. The symbolism ran deep in late 1970. At Plymouth, Massachusetts, on the site where the Pilgrims landed in 1620 on the Mayflower, and where there was a reconstructed version of the Mayflower, the American Indian movement showed up and occupied that ship. Then, not long after that, they occupied Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills. They set up camp on top of it and told the press that they had renamed it Mount Crazy Horse. In 1972, AIM members organized the Trail of Broken Treaties with the participation and support of several other Native American activist groups, including the National Indian Youth Council. They started in October on the West Coast and made their way across the entire country, headed to Washington, D.C. It was a large convoy of cars, trucks, and vans. And when they got to D.C., they then marched to the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in order to present the federal government with the 20 points that they had written out, things that they were demanding, all pertaining to treaty rights. One of those things was a demand to a return to treaties. Remember, the treaty era ended by an act of Congress in 1871. Also, the restoration of tribes that had been terminated. And here in the picture, you can see Dennis Banks and Carter Camp having to deal with some counter demonstrators as they're on their way to the BIA building. By the way, another of the 20 points was the end of the BIA. They were asking for that to be dissolved. When they reached the BIA building, and incidentally, this was 1 week before the presidential election of 1972. When they reached the building, the BIA officials refused to meet with them at all, and therefore refused to accept their demands. So the native activists, and there were about 500 of them, essentially took over the building and barricaded it. They destroyed some documents and deeds, and they held out for about a week, gathering a whole lot of attention. Again, right before the presidential election, President Nixon promised to look into some of their concerns, and then finally the occupation ended right around the time of the election. And as all these things are happening, the American Indian movement and American Indians in general are getting more and more press and more exposure. By the way, one of the activists who was on that trail of broken treaties across the country and who occupied the BIA building and who remained active with the American Indian movement for the events that we'll be talking about next was a Cherokee named Wes Studi, who had just recently returned from Vietnam and who after this would become an actor and become well known for his portrayals of Geronimo, Magua, Wovoka, and many others, and who was honored in 2020, I think it was 2020, for with an Oscar, a Lifetime Achievement Oscar, making him the first American Indian actor to have an Oscar. Now we're going to talk about something that happened earlier in 1972. And there's a reason we're kind of going out of order. It's because this ties in to something much larger that's going to happen later. And this is the death of Raymond Yellow Thunder. You can see him there in a picture on the left. He was from the Pine Ridge Reservation. He was Ogallala Lakota and was in fact the grandson of Chief American Horse the Younger. Across the state line in Kyle, Nebraska, Raymond Yellow Thunder in I believe it was February 1972 had been intoxicated. He was seen wandering around town, and a car slowed down, and a couple of white guys grabbed him and put him in the car and drove off with him. These guys had been overheard earlier saying that they were going to go bust an Indian. They wound up stripping him from the waist down and beating him severely. And then they tossed him out of the car in front of the American Legion building. Then he eventually stumbled to the police station and asked to be allowed to stay for the night, and they turned him away, claiming that they thought he was only drunk when in fact he was bleeding from this heavy beating. So he wandered off and died. His body was found 8 days later. The cause of death was blunt trauma, and these two white guys were arrested and were charged with manslaughter, and not murder, but manslaughter, and given sentence one of 6 years and one of 2 years, and they each got a $500 fine, which the family of Raymond Yellow Thunder thought was not a very harsh sentence for the way that they had brutally beaten to death this this man, this member of their family. In fact, the rumors that were circulating around the reservation was that he had not only been beaten, but he had been tortured and castrated, which was not the case, the latter rumor. But anyway, the elder women of the tribe contacted Russell Means, who was Ogallala and who had roots at Pine Ridge. They contacted Russell Means and asked for his help and the help of the American Indian movement. So this is while the investigation was going on. This is before the final decision was made. Anyway, about 1,400 American Indian movement members from 80 different tribes showed up at Pine Ridge and began protesting. And part of the complaint that the people had on the reservation was this wasn't the first time this had happened. It had happened with shocking regularity, not to this one guy, but members of the tribe being killed by white people and no serious charges being brought. There was a lot of complaint against the tribal council for not doing more, and against the Bureau of Indian Affairs for not interceding, for basically knuckling under to the people in these towns surrounding the reservation. So when AIM showed up and were protesting and putting all this pressure, it was an embarrassment to the tribal council and to the BIA. After the protests began, there were 5 arrests total from people who had witnessed what had happened and hadn't done anything, and the policeman who had turned the guy away was suspended. Well, this all happened in a fairly short amount of time, and then the AIM members went back to what they'd been doing before, and then which was in this case, planning that march, or rather that journey of the trail of broken treaties across the country, and then that was followed, of course, by what happened at the national BIA offices. But this incident is going to be repeated not long after that whole showdown in Washington, D.C. In January 1973, an Oglala named Wesley Badheart Bull from the Pine Ridge Reservation was stabbed in the chest by a white man in neighboring Custer County. The irony abounds, doesn't it? So there were several different versions of what happened, conflicting accounts, but some people said that the person who did the stabbing had claimed that he was wanting to kill an Indian and that it seemed to be unprovoked. Other people said that he felt threatened by John Wesley Badheart Bull, who was intoxicated. At any rate, he was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and pled down to involuntary manslaughter and spent 1 night in jail. The people on the reservation were outraged and once again called for the members of the American Indian movement to come and direct attention to this outrage of justice, this time again in Custer County. So Russell Means, Dennis Banks, and company once more headed to Pine Ridge. Since the last time AIM had been there to protest the killing of Raymond Yellow Thunder, a new tribal chair had been elected. Dick Wilson. He had actually been in support of the AIM protests over Raymond Yellow Thunder, but now that he was tribal chair as of April of that year, he felt very differently about it now that he was in charge. He had been given a grant from the Bureau of Indian Affairs for security, and he used that money to hire his own private security forces that he named the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, or Goons. Things were about to get very dramatic.